computer. Oh, so
hello, Dan.
Recording is on. We just got back from the beach, and here's Terry.
Well, I'm so glad to have this opportunity to just ask Dan Winter some questions. As those of you who have sent in questions know, this is sort of how to bring magic out of the Victorian age. And I asked Dan if I could just have a conversation with him. Some of these ideas of Dan's, like the waveguides and alphabets and the Hebrew flame letter, are ideas of his going back to the 90s, but it strikes me there's a whole generation of magicians that don't know them. And then some of his breakthroughs, like with Planck fire, I would rather have Dan explain how they connect to magic than to try to do so myself, because he's just written a whole book on it. So what can I, well, I'm assuming if you're joining us, you know Dan Winter, you know his work over several decades, fascinating work starting with Alphabet of the Heart all the way through to Planck Fire. But do you want to say a little bit more about your recent book before I start barraging you with questions here? Hi, Valerie.
Gradually, we've been here. Valerie, we're just back from a great day at the beach and lunch and a pretty decadent, wind blowing, suntan. Definitely the South France flavor over here. And as I told Terry, I didn't comb my hair because I thought it'd be more authentic.
I was going to put on Beach Boys music, but I thought, that might be overkill. So here we are.
Yeah. So as Terry asked appropriately, so, we've gradually been trying to make the science, serious, solid electrical engineering physics, more and more solid behind this work. And you know that my fourth book, Origin of Negentropy, really tried to do that. However, when it became clear that physicists have mostly agreed that charge collapse causes gravity and that charge collapse causes consciousness, it became clear that if we in fact had the answer to the cause of charge collapse, we would then, by definition, have answered the question of why do objects fall to the ground and why does consciousness exist? The charge implosion due to charge collapse, if you take this Planck length and time, the musical key signature of every wave that physics has ever measured, the musical key signature of the universe, Planck length and time, and simply multiply by powers of golden ratio, which is fractality perfected, which is embedding perfected, which is entanglement perfected, physics definition of action at a distance, which is fractality perfected, suddenly you have the answer to the cause of charge collapse, therefore the cause of gravity and consciousness. So it was a new way of expressing the deep physics, which is if you figured out what causes charge to collapse, then you've answered almost every question, the deepest questions of all of physics, the cause of gravity, the cause of consciousness, and the cause of magic. And that's why we're here, actually, that whatever causes charge to become centripetal does all the magic. We've said many times that the solution to charge compression is the answer to almost every mystery in physics, from the cause of fusion, the cause of alchemy, urban design, the history of computing. It's all the story of the answer to compression, how you make lead out of gold. It is literally non-destructive fusion of charge collapse solution, which is, isotope transition, all of these things. So
you have just basically answered like several questions of those already, but I'm probably going to ask them to you again, if you don't mind.
Well,
could I just say to folks out there, when you feel like that you cast a circle and you feel this sort of negative pressure in the middle of the room, that's what Dan is talking about. It's exactly the same. If a storm is passing over, you feel this great sort of letdown. Is beautiful if when you're in the center of the storm. So it's like it's a lot better to be the center of the storm than be buffeted about by the storm. So I think that's
that is the precisely most fabulous metaphor there is, because this is literally making the eye of the storm. We've said many times, when we figured out that when you teach kids to make golden ratio in their brainwaves at flameandmind.com, the Outer Vision Project, they begin to see without their eyes, and they all describe the same thing. A vortex tunnel tube appeared inside their head while they're blindfolded, and if they concentrate and focus and cause the center of that tornado to come to a point, then, and literally literally, an eyeball forms in the center of the plasma vortex tornado inside their head, and then they begin to see without their eyes. I mean, if ever there was evidence of an eye of a tornado and the physics of perception.
That's an awesome example, and that's some research that people working with Dan have going on. If you don't know about that, I'm wondering, can I just? I think the way this will work is if I share my screen, maybe it'll show up in a little box, and if you talk, maybe you'll show up in a big box. I don't know. I'm a little technologically impaired, but can I try that?
Whatever's fun, Terry. Whatever's fun. It's all good. It's all good. And
Okay.
so when we measure at flameinmind.com, we help people get to this golden ratio implosive cascade in their brainwave. And what they're doing is developing the inner muscle to squeeze that plasma vortex, bringing the tornado to a point which makes an eyeball. And now suddenly you can know what that compression also causes lucid dreamings. And that plasma vortex is what you take with you when you go take your consciousness outside your head. So it is a central metaphor, absolutely. And it's certainly what we'll be talking about when we talk about the physics of alphabets and how to cast those plasma shadows.
And by the way, that wonderful torus you have there that has all the colors on it, the maximum number you can have there is 7. Is there a particular reason for that is significant?
She's asking all the right questions. It's so much fun. No, well, it's called the most ancient problem in topology, which is how do you make a 7-color map such that all colors touch each other? And it's a very touching answer, which is the arrows that touch the 7 colors are literally the 7 arrows of the tetra cube, which is if you cast this on flatland, you make the 7-circuit Cretan, Minoan labyrinth, which is the archetype of turning inside out. And by the way, if you take the letters of the Hebrew word Bereshith, that first in principle in the beginning, literally that shadow is this map to turning inside out on the surface of a torus, which is the turns of mind necessary to implode an inner tornado. And that is in the beginning. Bereshith.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked the right question. And by the way, when you are casting a circle, casting a pentagram, whatever it is you cast, where you're going to do a working, you should feel this toroidal energy spinning through there. I mean, if you don't, you're doing some nice theater, but it may not be magic. So
it might blow your doors off.
It might. If you're doing it, well, then you'd be doing magic. So this is the screen that I made here, but hopefully those of you watching are just seeing this up in a little corner and you're seeing Dan. So could you've already really done this first one. Could you go over what you've said about the physics of casting a circle and how that relates to the magic of implosion? But is there more that you would want to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, I was playful with Terry when we first started this conversation that I thought the word magic, as in magi and mag, matrix of Agni or matrix of fire, one of the roots of the term Agni is the matrix which makes the flame that does not consume, which is another way to say, the history of magic or the ancestor of the concept of magic is literally the charge implosion that creates a centering point, a centripetal force, and then creates a sphere of the differentiation of the membrane of the area over which that centripetal pressure has coherence, literally your magic bubble. And the other term from magic also, as in magi or amygdala, the amygdala means to tower, the amygdala of the mouth of the snake brain, which is the base of the higher brain, and the amygdala to tower, as in the sense of migdal, also is where the flaming mouth of the serpent current is then presented to the bird brain in physics of Kundalini. And that may be another root to the word magi. The point is that the whole root of this idea of magic is very specifically the matrix of Agni, absolutely, which is to say the flame that does not consume, which was, in Einstein's language, he knew non-destructive compression would answer the unified field, but because he didn't understand the cause of charge collapse, he never learned why an object falls to the ground, nor the origin of any centripetal force. And that is the key to magic.
Well, and gravity is the big mystery, or has been until recently. Oh, I have my question seemed kind of pedestrian here after what you just said, but I will keep going down this list. And one is, does that shouldn't be impulsive there? My goodness, implosive. I think that I was hit up there with a autocorrect. The implosive pressure caused the cube or hypercube that when you cast, say, a pentagram, and if you cast it the way that Vincent Bridges taught, where you have a point in the center, which isn't the way that people always do it, but then you have a hypercube and it rotates through its center. So is that the implosive pressure that is causing it to do that? Because then you in effect have a torus and you feel this rotation.
That's right. And one way to have that conversation is to realize that the tetracubic symmetries by themselves. Oh yes, here I have my little. I gotta get it out, just because this is in honor of Bucky.
Oh yes,
we have to do Bucky. So
yes,
this is tetracubic, cube octa, and in this symmetry you have only powers of 2, and there is no implosion because there's no golden ratio. There's only roots of 2, square roots of 2, and multiples. Mm-hmm. Tetracubic. But then, however, when that's rotated to icosahedondeca, suddenly then everything is golden ratio, and that is implosive. So that's the metaphor, that the way the tetracube fits the tetracube here, which is in green, red, almost can see the cube in the middle.
Okay.
The green, red cube in the middle. So the way the tetracube fits in the pentodeca is, and this is an ancient argument we had with Vincent for years, that perhaps the ultimate hypercube is the dodecaecosa. At least it is the doorway to the next dimension. The point is, in pure principle, if you cast only a tetracube, that in itself doesn't make implosion. For example, if you take a cube of lasers to phase conjugate, they won't make a phase conjugate mirror unless there is a super dielectric phase conjugate barium strontium titanate phase conjugate mirror material at the center to enable the implosion. And that implosion is enabled only when the tetracube is embedded in the pentodeca, the metaphor for which is hypercube. In other words, the thing ain't going to implode until you go from hex to pent.
And that, by the way, anyway, that's really critical, because the pent as a structure, people, it's pervasive in the Western mystery tradition. People know it's important. You ask why it's important, you get things like, well, it's the shape that the orbit of Venus, like all those things. Yes, all those things are true, but those don't really bring about the magic you're doing. I mean, what Dan is talking about brings that about. And so again, you probably answered a question before I ask it, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. Alan had a question that several members of our group liked and wanted to ask. And so Alan, my husband, who's the Enochian magician, not Alan Moore, the British graphic novelist guy, he has noticed often that when he casts pentagrams in a supreme invoking ritual of the pentagram, and he's casting them as pentagram pentagons, which is fractal, and then they self-organize into a dodecahedron. So he asks, and several other people wanted to know specifically how that self-organized form works with your star mother that you were just showing us.
Yeah, well, and just to back up slightly here, if you were talking to a serious wave mechanics, physics kind of guy, the way to say this is, our equations for the first time proved that golden mean ratio is the solution to constructive wave interference, therefore the solution to compression, therefore the solution to implosion, therefore the solution to all centripetal forces. And we newly wrote those equations, and that is the centerpiece of PlanckFire.com, those publications. So that's the solid physics here, that once you learn, there is only one real solution to compression in wave mechanics, and it is the golden mean ratio. You know, all the conversation about beauty and aesthetics is wonderful, but the solid physics that's beneath all of that is the fact that that's the only way to implode waves, and which is to say to implode charge. But then
the subtext, by the way, is read Dan's Planck Fire if you want a longer discussion of this, and there will be a link to that below afterwards.
Yeah, PlanckFire.com, PHIRE. And by the way, the PDF is free and the Kindle is cheap, and the print is coming soon. So this is shareable wave. Anyway, but then we have Alan's question. So, you know, in terms of the relationship of the pent to this Star Mother kit, is that if you rotate, and it's a 32-degree angle, and you can barely see it in here, that if you tilt the bottom of the cube 32 degrees, the chin angle of the sinks, and then rotate blink 5 times, you have a pentodeca, and we could dig out the visuals, and you've all seen them. And that is basically what I think is the highest meaning of the term hypercube, in my view, although Vincent would disagree. But anyway, the point is that
I felt like I was trying to understand your stuff and listening to him argue about it, and then listening to him say how brilliant you are. So just to throw out, I think, although I'm not sure, and he's dead though and can't argue with me unless the lights blink on and off here, that one way to approach that is, it seemed like what you were using more, if you were graphing it out, the geometry of Buckminster Fuller, and he was using Cartesian geometry. And if you mediate it that way, then actually the ideas fit together, it seemed to me. Now, I'm not as good at either of these things as the two of you were, but.
Well, the concept of Cartesian ultimately means the best way for waves to cross. It's very simple. And the answer, the actual deep physics of that is, what is the best way to superpose axes of spin rotation in physics in charge? And that's the only map to the next dimension for sure. And you cannot superpose spin upon a tetracube in any other way constructively than use golden ratio and make pentodeca. So golden ratio is also the only solution to adding superposed axes of spin, and therefore charge compression and implosion. And there is no other ultimate definition of going to the next dimension. And the reason why that gets into all the mystical stuff is that as soon as you do that, that implosion to center generates coherence into the nodes of compression of the longitudinal array. And that is DNA radio. That's the collective unconscious. And that connectivity array, where how ancestral memory propagates, and the only physics of telepathy, and the only physics of action at a distance, and the only proven physics of gravity waves, longitudinal waves, Tom Bearden, is that longitudinal array, how to talk to your ancestors. And by the way, those kids who learn to see without their eyes very quickly realize that they're also seeing their ancestors. Isn't that interesting? Physics of clairvoyance. And by the way, while I'm carrying on too fast here, when physics says that the only solution in conventional physics is entanglement, what they forget to mention is the climax to perfected entanglement is called phase conjugation. And what enables the array of action at a distance is the longitudinal nodes at that center, which they call Einstein-Rosen bridge, which is a lousy language for the more accurate physics of coherent longitudinal interferometry. There, I said my piece. I'm shutting up now.
Well, now I have another question since you brought up longitudinal arrays. Can you explain the difference between a simple longitudinal wave, since we're going to talk about magical forms as standing waves, and you have you have a variety of kinds of waves, but what's the relationship between a longitudinal wave and a longitudinal array?
Yeah, well, and we have lots of graphics for this, but, and by the way, all those graphics are at fractalfield.com/conjugate mind. And you can see the graphics of the difference between a transverse electromagnetic versus a compressional, scalar, or longitudinal electromagnetic wave. And physics does not know how to manipulate longitudinal EMF. Sorry, that's why they don't know what a gravity wave is. Oops, as Tom Bearden's equations proved, that's what gravity waves are made. And it's actually intuitively obvious that if you want to make centripetal force, the arriving transverse wave is not going to accomplish squeezing. No, it's only the compressional symmetric opposing longitudinals which will implode the center of that nucleus, making what's called gravity. So, but then Terry's excellent question. The difference, the longitudinal wave is this compressional, sometimes called scalar compressional component of the wave, whose axis of wave motion is parallel to the direction of propagation, therefore efficient, and reaches longer distances. So that's a longitudinal wave, incorrectly called scalar. Now, the array, which is everything, the longitudinal array is everything. It's ancestral memory. It's the only physics of telepathy. It's the only physics of action at distance. It's the only physics of heaven. It's the only physics of how to get through death. So everybody should damn well be studying longitudinal arrays, if you ask me. So that's the, but the array exists in the point that at the compression node center, that still point,
right,
is initiated. You could call it DNA radio, but it's actually the fact that the compressional component of that array will then bounce only to the next node of that array, which looks exactly like this in the Earth grid, for example. And at those bounce points. Only at the compression points is consistently the longitudinal inertia exchanging momentum with the transverse inertia, which specifically means that is the only way to contain heat at a distance. Hint to every fusion physicist on the planet who's wasting billions of dollars because they don't know how to contain heat at a distance. What stupidity! You do a longitudinal interferometry of microwave and you can contain heat at a distance, absolutely, instead of wasting half the money on the planet. So, but the point is that these compression points of these longitudinal rays can contain heat at a distance because that restored compression node of that array can then distribute the inertia at a distance of the compression of the longitudinal array, which is why it's the only physics of telepathy, as Korotkov proved. Military quality telepathy was only at the Earth grid longitudinal node points, and we know why. And Bruce Cathy proved reduced nuclear critical mass at those same node compression points. We know why, and that's why those compressional node points reduce nuclear critical mass measurably. Oops. Oh, that was a secret for national security. Oops.
This is also, isn't it, a notion of like when you talk about, say, the Disclosure Project and the work Stephen Greer has done and so on, when people have these incredible telepathic experiences that they're not saying with angels, they're saying it's with ETs. I mean, that's how you explain such things. Or the whole notion of how you guide in some craft, which is something Greer talks about at great length. Well, he doesn't.
And when you literally get to the still point of that array and inhabit the array, very specific example, at the moment of death, which is a black hole of successful compression, if successful, the synaptic array, which is the array you used to inhabit, the compression vortex that's called your consciousness must learn how to inhabit a larger array, the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, the songline of the ancestors. And this is the longitudinal array of a bigger array. And by the way, if you jump off into it from a node, the sacred space, instead of from a hospital, you got a much better shot at it. So it's not a radical idea to say that consciousness inhabits an array. That's an old idea. The old array is called your synapses. The bigger array is called the longitudinal nodes of the earth. In both cases, a vortex inhabits an array. And if you want to lucid dream and take memory through death, study this carefully.
And it's also why if somebody is like a ghost hunter and is trying to get a ghost out of their house and saying, go to the light, it's basically trying to get them to a point on the Earth grid where they can
unpack.
Jump off.
Yeah.
Okay,
and in fact, it's that the fact that Therify has been notable in helping release ghosts. We know the physics of releasing the ghosts. It's not a mystery that if at the moment of death centripetal force is not great enough, then the memories haven't imploded into the longitudinal array sufficiently, and the ghost is stuck, actually. Yeah, that's why anger can't make it through death. But anyway, go ahead with your next question.
Well, go ahead. There's a question here that Nick Denton, who's very active on our group, had, and I think other people, it's very pointed, and I think other people might want to know this. So he says, what does the integer n represent along the x-axis in the equation for implosive charge, collapse, and negentropy that you have? So the Planck length or time times the golden ratio, and then you have n.
Yeah, in that chart, n is the integer exponent multiple of golden ratio times Planck. So you take Planck length and time, 1.61 times 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, Planck length, and you simply multiply by whole number powers of golden ratio repeatedly. And that process is the number of powers of whole number powers of golden ratio you multiply is the number n there. For example, the number of powers of golden ratio times Planck, which produce precisely the two colors which make photosynthesis possible, very narrow band, prove that phase conjugation times Planck is the reason photosynthesis, and in fact, the reason rainbows exist. So it's a very powerful concept.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. This one about casting shapes, you've already answered. And so I had some others here about casting shapes, waves, and the axes of spin. This was somebody coming from, again, the perspective of someone who practices magic in a more traditional way. And so what does the understanding of higher dimensional geometry actually do for your practice? Now, I don't know if you want to answer that or you want me to, but I'll certainly defer to whatever you have to say first.
Well, I think I may start and you finish.
Okay.
Just to say, you know, the biggest stargate in this galaxy, the subject of the Orion Wars, is the cubic trapezium in Orion. And the reason that was the best stargate, literally the one you could go farthest in this galaxy, and that's what the war was about, was because there was more implosive compression in that double vortex, the trapezium in Orion. And you'll see the slides, fractalfield.com/slideshow. Point being that in that case, the number of axes of spin symmetry that were superposed was greatest. So the idea that when you go to a higher dimension, you get more implosive compression is specifically this idea that harmonic inclusiveness up that ladder of compression increases the power of the squirt gun at the center, quite literally, which is why harmonic inclusiveness defines health, measurably immune health, in heart rate variability. Harmonic inclusiveness defines the life not only of you and your tree, but also your galaxy.
Well, I would just simply think of the compression going in your consciousness when you're doing that. That's why the more you understand what you're doing, the better you do it. But it's not to say that the same thing isn't happening if you're not. It's like if somebody doesn't have to understand the theory of music to sing on key. But if they don't have a very good ear and they sing off key, they may never recognize, and then you get more and more noise, and pretty soon you just have a mess, basically. Now, it also gives some explanations of how people are doing things, and whether you talk about it in Enochian has something that's contained in the Great Table, or you talk about it as CDs, you know, and you're talking about astral travel and remote viewing and so on. It makes some people better to feel more satisfied if they have an understanding of why they're doing works, because then they feel like they're not crazy. And, you know,
I like that.
Some of us have been told they're crazy for so long, we just don't care, but that's another matter.
Another fun way to think about that is, remember that time when Dee and Kelly didn't do their homework and they didn't learn the Ophanim Enochian alphabet. And so they felt this huge implosive squeezing, literally, like
which is like, you're gonna learn this the right way.
And that was a vice-like grip, literally a vice-like grip, which is the classic way to describe a mind meld with an Orion Queen Mog, High Draco Stickar. And the point being that the more you're centripetal, literally, the more conscious you are. By definition, by measurement. This isn't subjective. This isn't woo.
Well, and see, this is threatening to some people, because then they think, oh, especially people who channel a lot, like, which is something that Alan does, for example. Then they're like, well, is this me or is that them? Well, it's a mind meld. It's kind of, you know, there's a reason why people who channel better in their native language, and why their vocabulary tends to get mixed up with what's coming through. But it's true channeling is a mixture. It's not just, you know, you have this, I mean, you can do it that way. There's this great gap in your conscious, but first that makes for really poor psychological health, easy manipulation, and psychological problems. Whereas the other one, if you understand what is happening, it doesn't, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, and so what you're visualizing, you set up the conditions for implosive compression. And my favorite example actually is when Alan and Terry went in the 4 directions in Torino, and they blew these letter forms, and you could feel, you know, literally implosive compressions. And what were those letters, Terry?
Well, they were the letters on the Great Table, I mean on the Tablet of Union, if I remember. But then before that, things were getting very intense when we even did a pentagram. That was the very first thing. So that was the 4 letters of Yod He Vav He.
Yes, and if we knew the physics of the origin of those letters, we were simply taking the vortex and doing this and this and this and this, and looking at that shadow and blowing that donut. Literally blowing that donut. And that's the deep vision here, that we know the optical cortex is literally a charged hologram. It's a net of fireflies. It's the cast of synapses. It's that net. And when you form that Hebrew letter of those 4 directions accurately and occupy the whole optical cortex with one Hebrew letter at a time and focus on it and let it stand there, and then you release it, you've literally blown a smoke ring at a certain angle of tilt. That's it. And if you blow those smoke rings in a sequence of angles of tilt, not only do you make magic because you make the centripetal implode, but that's the only physics of how to make the atomic table, by the way.
Well, I'll back off from the atomic table, and just since you've hit another question, and this was some of the first work of yours I came across, and Alan had seen it before I had, and was like, "This is brilliant. You've got to watch this." This was in old video times. Can you talk a little bit about your work with the Hebrew flame letter and how if you project light through a tetrahedron, you get the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and so forth? I mean, I think there's a whole generation now of young magicians who maybe don't know that.
Yeah, so I was looking to see if I had those animations handy here, but oh, here we are. Right. So are you seeing there's Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. So I've taken the self-organizing 7-color map, golden spiral, self-organized, superposed on the torus, and now I simply look at it from the face angles of the 7 spin symmetries of the tetracube. And that creates the origin of Hebrew, literally, which is simply a sequence of shadows on the wall of the cave of the spiral. And that spiral map enables casting, in this case, a tetracubic array. And so this is what we talked about in terms of, Bereshith, when I talked about the first word of Genesis. And this is how, when the DNA actually implodes after this Bliss process, there's recursive braiding in DNA. And when the DNA turns inside out recursively like this, at the center point, the DNA actually, in the presence of Bliss, actually, here's the measurement photomicrograph of DNA becoming a donut, literally the Lord of the Ring. And the letters on the side of that ring, obviously, are simply, the pure intention that results in those who have pure intention have the torus in their DNA, literally microchloridians in their blood, and their wishes become objects because they're implosive, and their bliss actually bends the light. Only love bends the light, therefore only love creates. So this is the idea. This is what the Lord of the Ring is the perfect implosion in toroidal DNA, literally the result of bliss. So, and by the way, the climax of the wonderful lecture we just did with Elena Danan, which is being released tomorrow. Our new lecture with Elena Danan with the whole slideshow releases tomorrow. And the climax of that lecture was, why did Enki, for whom Earth is named, is Earth, why did he say that when humankind grows up to the Adam Kadmon, which is ensoulment, literally the recipe for DNA for bliss, why will a billion stars twinkle? And here's the physics measured 11 different times. When humans, when a million children sang the same song at the same time, it was measured 11 times. The sun went, ah. The solar flares were dramatically affected. We became sun gods. Osiris was Enki, basically, and the sun god. And so the physics is that stars went to that much trouble to make our DNA for one specific purpose, which was the centripetal force that we add to the birth of stars is actually why every ancient religion is about sun gods. So did I carry on and miss the question?
Well, you answered the question. You also have the most associative mind of any person I've ever met in my life. So I can follow you about 90% of the time, which is a great improvement. I mean, it's improved over the years. But on the simple side, you're getting all the letters in that sacred alphabet, and all the things you say follow. So how do you define a sacred language then? That was another question we had. Is it a waveguide basically, or?
You could discuss philosophy all day, but if we're discussing physics, the only alphabet that ever existed is wave symmetry. There is no other symbol set. There isn't. Now, they say alphabets can be ideographic, pictographic, or audiographic, which is why if you say Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet accurately into a spectrum analyzer, and I replicated Carlos Suarez's cipherogenesis spectrograms of the Hebrew alphabet after Fred Wolf did in my first book, Alphabet of the Heart. And indeed, we had a powerful Jewish lady prove if you pronounce the sacred Hebrew alphabet accurately into an audio spectrum analyzer, and you can see all this at goldenmean.info/DNA ring, that in fact, the spectrograms of the Hebrew alphabet make the pictures of the letters. So audiographic, yes. Shadows of the harmonics, shadow of the wall of the cave, yes. Does that mean that you could then speak the sacred alphabet into a spectrum analyzer and that would be the machine code of the ultimate computer? Yes. But more than that, it is not just audiographic. It is then more than pictographic, more than ideographic. It is literally the shadows of the toroids of charge indexed by Platonic symmetry to make the only physics that is the atomic table. And I can dig out those slides later, but the atomic table, SPDF subshells, is tetracube, dodecaecosa. That's what it is.
Well, if you want to dig those out anytime, that's great, because we have a final question. I mean, I have a bunch of questions before the final, but one that came in from another of our group members was to talk about the application of this in other fields like chemistry. So.
Oh, good. Okay, so here's where I got your slides ready, but then you beat me to it, which is fine. But here is the geometric basis for the periodicity of the elements. So notice that the atomic table, literally here, are you seeing? Yeah. So this is from 21st Century Magazine, Lawrence Heck, very famous, that the actual Platonic nest here is the symmetry of the arrangements of the hadrons of the nucleus. So protons and neutrons nest in the nucleus to make the entire atomic table only by using tetracube octaecosa. That's clear. That's the chemist Moon's work. So make the Platonic nest, literally the star mother kit, and you finished making the nucleus. Now, if you take the electron shells, the whole atomic table is SPDF, subshells, and the s suborbital is obviously just a torus. The pi suborbital, everybody knows, is a tetracube, and that's why there's 3 pairs, 6 electrons. And the df suborbital, 10, 14 electrons, 5, 7 vortex pair, is dodecaecosa, obviously. So the Platonic nest is the atomic table. So if you learn how to nest donuts into the Platonic solids, not only do you have the entire atomic table, but also you have the geometry of the planetary orbitals that stabilize gravity in the solar system. Kepler was right. Planetary orbitals have to be Platonic because that's the only way you can stabilize gravity. I mean, centripetal force. So it is about building the Platonic nest for sure. And nesting donuts to do that is the solution.
Thank you. That was that's the best preparation for a question I think I've ever seen. So here we let's see. I think you've answered the middle one here. Let me ask you this top one. No, I asked you that top one. So I'm down at the bottom. Can you give a slower explanation of how DNA has 5 or 7 axes of spin, or am I getting that wrong? Does the seal of Ammit, which has 5, 6, and 7, have the same axes of spin? Well,
if you would then unshare your screen, I have a graphic. I'm ready for that. So if you look, here are the 5, 7 spin symmetry axes. So it's called Anu, what the clairvoyants saw when they looked at the heart of the sun, the heart of the human, and the heart of hydrogen. They saw the same thing in each case, and it was proven in physics. They called it Anu, sun god. What they meant was Star Mother kit. That's what they saw. They called it Anu, but it's actually Star Mother kit. The 5 spins inside is actually the 5 spins of the cube of the dodec. And the 7 spins outside is the 7 spins of the tetracube, as in the exact layers of human heart muscle layered precisely in the 7 axes of spin of the tetrahedron. You couldn't get a better squeeze. So, so now if you look down the ladder that is DNA, you take that tetracube, you rotate that cube into a pent dodeca.
The cube is tilted back.
And here you have 7 spins outside. There's 6 plus 1, there's 7. And then you have 5 spins inside. And so now you realize that the dodecahedron, which starts that ladder in DNA, the dodeca you started with is literally, remember the tetracube three, the cube three spin, the dodeca, the fourth axis spin. The fifth axis of spin symmetry is rotating that dodeca down a helix. That's what the fifth axis of spin is. I think we can do that here.
Yeah.
So the thread that is DNA is literally 5 spins. There are 5 spins in that thread. I think this animation might be a little better. So the fifth axis of spin, there's 5 spins in the thread that is DNA. And then if you, in response to the feeling of bliss, you braid the braid of the braid on the braid 7 times, the plot thickens. I mean, the thread thickens. I mean, the thread is braided into rope, into string, and the string into rope, and the rope into fat rope. And that embedding, that nesting here, if you see it in DNA, at the climax point of that 7 spins of braiding process, here's the measurement of the DNA responding to heart coherence by the zipper, the enzyme that causes it to braid. Glenn Ryan did these measures, that at the 7th recursive spin braid on the braid, inhabiting that tornado, you get this process where the DNA actually turns inside out. And that's when you see the, I don't know if this is going to play. This animation's a little slow. It's a 3D. And the braid and the braid. Too many movies, too little time. But the seventh recursive spin, the DNA becomes a donut, toroidal. So once you have 7 spins outside, the 7th recursive braid operation, called Boson 7, when Montauk measured which teenager could steer the timeshare, physics of lucid dreaming, called midi-chloridians or microchloridians in the blood, when the Jedi become plasma projective. That is 7 spins outside. So 5 spins inside, 7 spins outside is more than metaphor. It is the physics. And that's why I think that is the sigil of truth accurately in the Ophanim Enochian, because it's good physics. And it doesn't mean you have 12 strands in your DNA. Any biophysicist will say that's crap, but you have 12 recursive spin braid superposed embedding success after the climax to bliss process. Absolutely, yes. And, Elena said correctly, well, are they going to make 12 strands of my DNA? No, you're going to do that yourself when you learn how to contain bliss.
Okay. Thanks. Hey, by the way, since you mentioned plasma, we had one person asking what plasma was. You're just going by a fairly straightforward scientific definition. It's a 4th state of matter after solid, liquid, gas. That's what you mean by plasma, right?
The term plasma can be confusing, actually, and plasma also refers to the clear liquid in the blood, which is
right.
And yet the clear liquid in blood is a charged container, and that charge could also be called plasma. So there is some ambiguity here. But the basic meaning in physics of plasma is charge that is circulating without the compression to make mass, for example. So normally you can't have a cloud of charge without heat. And so normally a cloud of charge in physics named plasma uses heat to keep the cloud of charge spinning. However, under certain circumstances, you can make it a cloud of charge without heat, called CAP, cold atmospheric plasma, which is the hottest subject in conventional medicine today, because you can heal so many things with it. Cold atmospheric plasma. This is not new. This is not new woo-woo. This is the hottest subject in most of medicine. Cold atmospheric plasma heals lots of things. Now, we think we have the best solution to circulating charge without heat, Therify.net, because phase conjugation, by definition, is the implosion that eliminates heat, namely the flame that does not consume. For example, the moment Schauberger knew his vortex, which was a plasma vortex, water vortex was charged vortex, he knew when it was going to begin to making electricity from gravity. The moment it spontaneously began getting colder, that's called negentropy. And that implosion of charge by eliminating heat creates cold atmospheric plasma. So another way of talking about your very important question is to say, the universe is made of one single contiguous superfluid substance. We call it charge. When that charge circulates, one name for that in physics is called plasma. And when that charge has compression and rarefaction, it's called plus and minus charge, sometimes yin and yang. And the compression and rarefaction of that charge is the only substrate of the universe, sometimes called the ether, and it behaves like a superfluid. So can you say what charge is? No, because it's everything. There's nothing that ain't. Literally,
Awesome.
exactly. It's all charge.
You know, Dan, I think I just thank you for that. That's awesome. I'm going through these questions that folks have sent in here, and I want to make sure I haven't missed one. And I am going to share my screen again. A shout out to my longtime friend, Brian Fritz, who I once 20 years ago mistook for Vincent Bridges. That's a story we'll just laugh between the two of us about until the day we die, because after all, he didn't call the police and report me for it. So Brian had a question for you about Hebrew letters or Enochian letters. Since they can be viewed as waveguides, can all letters in all languages be thusly viewed? This is something he and I have argued about, where I've said, well, not really, it wouldn't be coherent. But if all language is holistic, intuitive, and telepathic inherently, and an exchange of knowledge in a coded form only secondary. Now, I'm not sure if you've answered this or not, so I'm just going to throw that out there and pass it on to you.
Yeah, well, the term sacred here simply really means resonant. For example, I believe the Koreans and Japanese, there are lots of Asian languages where you have to have perfect pitch, or you can't pronounce the different phonons of the different
Chinese, Mandarin, that's certainly true. It's you start sounding really funny.
You had to get the pitch right, or you didn't get the letter right. So in those languages, they're audio dominant. Now, does that make it a sacred language? Well, remember, the term sacred actually only means resonant, and everything's relative in that sense. However, the more a language enables you to do the physics of creation, the more sacred it becomes. That's why I felt it was significant. We showed, and you can see this at goldenmean.info/DNA ring, that the same shadows we just showed you for Hebrew, if you take and put the trigrams off the top of the Hebrew letters, and you put the vertical and horizontal bars, the same letters make Sanskrit. Oh, so this was an optical series of shadows, literally for imploding donuts. Are these languages sacred? Well, they're an attempt to codify the wave mechanics of creation. And every language is an attempt to codify the physics of creation. And ultimately, the physics of creation itself is the ultimate language. That means if you studied enough to learn to visualize the foci that could implode charged donuts into the symmetry called the atomic table, you are the ultimate alchemist. You are the imploder. And every language attempts to do that. The Hebrew did pretty well, because not only do you have the optical symmetry of the shadows, but you also have the spectrum analysis of the audio harmonics making the letters themselves. So you have the audio phonon index and you have the optical symmetry index. So yes, that's a sacred alphabet. Is it the ultimate sacred alphabet? No, the ultimate sacred alphabet is the symmetry operations which make matter out of light. That is what we're all trying to emulate. And that is the ultimate way. And that's called pure principle. And when you can visualize that, well, you are immortal.
And well, that would be a good place to stop on. But I have promised people I'm going to ask, and I'm down to, I think, 3 more questions. Okay. So this is again with language and sound. So we're going back to vibrating the calls and so on. Why don't more Enochian folks understand the sound piece to the fourfold nature of magic? Well, the fourfold nature of magic that the different Brian is talking about is a bit different than the 4-wave mixing, or is it?
Well, I know precisely what 4-wave mixing means. 4-wave mixing means that you cannot make lasers conjugate unless you start with a cube, basically. So the waves have to implode from exactly opposite directions, and that's how you make all implosion. That's the start of all negentropy, the start of all phase conjugation. Sacred 4 directions is 4-wave mixing. Is why Agnihotra works. So that's the fourfold nature of now the fourfold nature of magic, I don't know about.
Well, I would just say with the people who are talking about ceremonial magic, Brian is absolutely right. They don't look at the sound piece that much. But My answer here will be much more simple than Dan's. I think people don't use it because a lot of magic stays in the head. And when you are vibrating sound and you're vibrating it with particular energy centers and you're trying to make those coherent with each other and recognize, then you're bringing it into the body. I mean,
Well,
it's in
yeah,
Western metaphysics has a mind-body problem, but
and you could say, supposing you're visualizing optically the sacred letters, and then you pronounce those sacred letters very accurately. If you ever pronounced Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, and tried to do it with enough strength so it shows up on an audio spectrum analyzer, that is a very useful exercise, because you're literally realizing you're making a shadow of light. You're literally blowing applicative. The sequence of vowel tones move from the base of the tongue to the tip of the tongue. And that plicative sequence can be implosive. For example, if you say I, accurately, you've literally made a caduceus.
Well, you can also do this up the body centers with some kind of yoga. And if you are vibrating something like Adonai, you can at least feel, well, you can feel that in every energy center. Others, and I'm thinking of the middle pillar exercise because it's one where we've done a lot of work with this. If you are, well, Vincent changed the pronunciation of a heye, which was kind of a radical thing to do because he thought people weren't vibrating it right, so it wasn't resonating with the crown chakra. He was doing ihaya. If you can do a heye, I think it works better. Then you have it vibrate with the top energy center, where Yehovah, and you can feel that in your chest, Elohim, and you push it out your third eye. So there are intonation things that you do. Now, how that particular wavelength on the spectrum of wavelengths intersects with, I mean, you're in a way different register when you're talking about wavelengths of light than you are with sound. Sound's much slower.
Yes, but the principles remain the same, that you're making light cones implode, and doing the light accurately with the sound is very powerful. And those certainly would be multiple dimensions magic. Another practical example that occurs to me, when you say yod, hey, va, hey, and you realize the sound yaw is making literally a sound vortex like this, yaw, whereas the va is the exact opposite vortex sound plasma applicative symmetry. So you're literally taking two opposing light cones, yod and va, and each one you animate with hey. He means amorphous and space filling. Many women would describe their men that way. Hey.
I don't think I'll touch that. Okay. I have two more questions.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Before I lose it here. I have never thought of Alan as hay. I just want to make that clear. So one was from Dylan Adams, who has been asking all kinds of wonderful questions. It was if we could give the sound of each Enochian letter. Now I have to say, Dee and Kelly never did that, and Alan and I are already on record as saying, you know, you're looking for resonance within your body with those. But I want to combine that question of hers, which you can agree or disagree with several people. Bartimaeus Black was one of them, and I forget the other person. It was about spurious effects from Enochian, the kind that, say, Crowley and Newberg, I would say, got with some of their vision and the voice stuff. I've always said that you get spurious effects when Enochian, when you're not doing it right. You don't have a temple set up right, or you're ignoring its capacity to bring up issues because it's helping you evolve, and that means getting rid of some of the junk. But that may be a very simple answer. That's what's worked for us, but I would like to pass those on to Dan. So again, they're correct pronunciation of Enochian and spurious effects from Enochian. Any words of wisdom about those two things?
You're probably more expert than me, but I have some fun comments. First of all, I so much admire you, and particularly Alan, apparent clairvoyance to actually know and see what it means to set up a temple, which is obviously a charged wave bubble. And I admired that skill. I felt your skill to do that in Torino, and I admire that skill. And I'm very aware that I don't have that skill, by the way.
Well, you've been doing lots of other things.
Well,
I would say we've had
I have a lot of psychokinesis, which means I can charge such a thing by being there and feeling a lot of.
And you sure do. When Dan is in a Nokian temple, Dan's hair stands on end, and as we've had doors blow out. But that's
I can add charge, but to have the discipline to see and set up the shape with discipline do the temple, that's Alan's genius, and I admire that from a distance for now. But the other. The other irrelevant distraction I'd like to ignore your question with is I just remember so vividly, there we were in Greece. It was in Athens, wonderful group. And we were explaining the origin of Greek. And the audience in Greek would rather shoot you than listen to you say there is an origin for Greek. They would rather you be dead than try to say there's some root to Greek.
I'll remember not to do that.
Yeah, no, the Greeks would rather shoot you than listen to you tell there's an origin of Greece. There I was on the stage. It was messy. And so then I asked Vincent the question. I said, well, because we did this table, I could bring up goldenmean.info/Greek, and you see the Greek letters and the Ophanim and Oki, and there's obviously, I said, well, is Ophanim really the origin of Greek? And he said, well, there was a little prejudice here, because when Dee and Kelly were reading the plasma shadows in the scrying, showstone, their prejudice was the Greek alphabet. So, of course, when they drew the pictures of what the letters looked like, they looked mostly like Greek because that was their favorite alphabet. So is Ophanim and Oki the origin of Greek or the other way around?
I'm not even going to touch that one because I have no idea. But reading Latin's enough for me. Have you ever tried reading ancient Greek? You probably have, but
it's Greek to me, absolutely.
I go find friends. That's a good thing about being in a university. You can go find your friends in the philosophy program who actually can read ancient Greek and say, well, can you help me? Anyway.
Yes. And they do not want to hear you tell them that something is older than Greek. Oh, you better duck because they're going to shoot you.
Well, I will stay outside of things I don't know, I guess.
But when you see, and then later we have this table that shows Ophanim and Nokian has the same shape as the old Cherokee alphabet. They called it a Dawi. Dahani Waki Rahi recognized. Well, why are all these things overlaid? Well, because all ancient sacred alphabets, H actually is the archetype of plasma domains nesting, making platonics. That's the simple truth.
Well, and I like to know that it's the waveforms that are forming the alphabet, and then you bring them back in and recycle them to bring back the correct waveform, whatever kind of thing.
The only alphabet that actually ever existed was symmetry. And, there's a billion inhabitable intelligent star systems in this galaxy. And I'm sure there's a billion cultures that say they're indigenous people invented. But actually, the origin of alphabet is pure principle only. It is not about, the name of some culture. No.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, I have no further questions here, but I really appreciate your joining me today to try to bring magic out of the Victorian age. I think we've succeeded.
If you're sitting there thinking, I would like to be more magical, and you sort of realize that if you distill all the issues in your life, the emotional issues, the physics issues, the financial issues, if you distill them into pure principle, like something that your ancestors are going to appreciate 1,000,000 years from now, and that's what's going to go through death only, you will find yourself becoming centripetal, as to say, compressed to pure principle, and that means you will survive death.
Well, amen. Is there anything you want to add? I'm sort of have nothing else to ask, really.
Yeah, well, people want to understand magic, and then some people say, physics, significantly advanced physics is always indistinguishable from magic. Another way of saying that is actually to say that there is nothing but the pure principle behind wave function. And the more you embed yourself into that, you know, Einstein graduated when he was able to ride like light, like a surfboard, because he could imagine that. So if you can do that inside your head and create that imagination, that's why it's so tragic if young people spend too much time passively in front of an image maker, their computer. They lose the inner muscle to make an inner image, to imagine, and they lose access to all of creation physics. This is a problem. So yeah, we really need to recognize, to show, you know, that's why the old Steiner school class, you know, have the kids visualize a rose, draw the picture, then make the vision, close their eyes, imagine a rose, and wait for the room to fill with the smell of roses. And we explain that physics very well. Those kids have learned how to implode inside their imagination, and they have access to creation.
That, I think that's a great note to end on. And magic is all about visualization. It's not that we don't want you to watch our wonderful videos, but close your eyes and visualize.
Exactly. Thank you for inviting such a fun conversation again,
Hey,
Teresa.
thank you for participating in it. I always love talking to you, Dan.
We're having fun. To be continued.
Yeah.
Thank you. Blessings.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.